I want to start with a little story that back when I was in my college days, back in the late 60s, early 70s, I was in an organization called Young Americans for Freedom, and we were on campuses all over America, and we had a film that we would take to local groups to show. It was called The Incredible Bread Machine, and it depicted the overreach of government. And the film ended, it got its title from a little story called Tom Smith's Incredible Bread Machine. And I wanted to just kind of share that with you to get started today, because I think it makes the point. So bear with me. This is a legend of success and plunder, and a man, Tom Smith, who squelched world hunger. Now, Smith, an inventor, had specialized in toys, so people were surprised when they found that he, instead of making toys, was baking bread. The way to make bread he'd conceived cost less than people could believe. And not just make it, this device could, in addition, wrap and slice. The price per loaf, one loaf or many, the minuscule sum of under a penny. Can you imagine what this meant? Can you comprehend the consequence? The first time yet, the world well fed, and all because of Tom Smith's bread. A citation from the president for Smith's amazing bread. This and other honors too were heaped upon his head. But isn't it a wondrous thing how quickly fame has flown? Smith, the hero of today, tomorrow scarcely known. Yes, the fickle years passed by. Smith was a millionaire, but Smith himself was now forgot, though bread was everywhere. People asked from where it came would very seldom know. They would simply eat and ask, was it not always so? However, Smith cared not a bit, for millions ate his bread, and everything is fine, he thought. I am rich, and they are fed. Everything was fine, he thought. He reckoned not with fate. Note the sequence of events starting on the date on which the business tax went up, and then, to a slight extent, the price of every loaf rose too, up to 1 full cent. What's going on? The public cried. He's guilty of pure plunder. He has no right to get so rich on other people's hunger. A prize cartoon depicted Smith with fat and drooping jowls, snatching bread from hungry babes, indifferent to their howls. Well, since the public does come first, it could not be denied that in matters such as this, the public must decide. So antitrust now took a hand. Of course it was appalled at what it found was going on. The Bread Trust, it was called. Well, now this was getting serious. So Smith felt that he must have a friendly interview with the Minute Antitrust. So hat in hand he went to them. They'd surely been misled. No rule of law had he defied. But then their lawyers said, the rule of law in complex times has proved itself deficient. We much prefer the rule of men. It's vastly more efficient. Now let me state the present rules, the lawyer then went on. These very simple guidelines you could rely upon. You're gouging on your prices if you charge more than the rest, but it's unfair competition if you think you can charge less. A second point that we would make to help avoid confusion, don't try to charge the same amount, that would be collusion. You must compete, but not too much. For if you do, you see, then the market would be yours, and that's monopoly. Well, price too high or price too low? Now, which charge did they make? Well, they weren't loath to charging both with public good at stake. In fact, they went one better. They charged monopoly. No muss, no fuss, oh woe is us. Egad, they charged all three. 5 years in jail, the judge then said. You're lucky it's not worse. Robber barons must be taught. Society comes first. Well, now bread is baked by government, and as might be expected, everything is well controlled, the public well protected. True, loaves cost $1 each, but our leaders do their best. The selling price is ½ cent. Taxes pay the rest. Once upon a time, There were people like Tom Smith. They lived in a land of plenty, where individuals were free to choose their life and their course of life, to fulfill their hopes and dreams and achieve success, no matter what their station at birth. They built great industries and manufactured unheard of luxuries that brought health and wealth for those who sought it. But they were beaten down and controlled by rules and regulations designed by lesser men who feared them. Always, there's been a king, a dictator, a potentate to decide the common good for all. And in their world, the reality was and is a never-ending cycle of poverty, misery, and hopelessness. And so, that world of Tom Smith, such a renegade land, needed to be harmonized into the well-controlled, well-organized family of nations for the common good of us all. They insist that to allow such a land to run willy-nilly on its own is dangerous to human society. But how to rein in such a renegade land? Welcome to the utopia of sustainable development and Agenda 21, the agenda for the 21st century. According to its authors, the objective of sustainable development is to integrate economic, social, and environmental policies in order to achieve reduced consumption, social equity, and the preservation of biodiversity. Sustainabilists insist that every societal decision be made on environmental impact, focusing on three components: global land use, global education, and global population control. Dave Foreman, the founder of one of the most radical and influential non-governmental organizations promoting sustainable policy, said this, quote, "My three main goals would be to reduce human population to about 100 million worldwide, destroy the industrial infrastructure, and see wilderness with its full complement of species returning throughout the world," end quote. Ask the ranchers in Montana how that new complement of wolves are helping them with their industries and survival. De-development and zero economic growth are two phrases that consistently come up in official policy guidelines for sustainable development. De-development and zero economic growth. Think about that. Paul Ehrlich, a professor of population studies at Stanford University, said this, quote, "A massive campaign must be launched to de-develop the United States. De-development means bringing our economic system into line with the realities of ecology and the world resources situation." They attack free enterprise as the real boogeyman, which they say causes environmental destruction and human misery. Maurice Strong, the head of the 1992 Earth Summit that introduced Agenda 21 to the world, said, quote, "Isn't the only hope for the planet that the industrialized nations collapse? Isn't it our responsibility to bring that about?" A document that was brought to the world, Agenda 21, and that is how he described it: to make the industrial nations collapse and we're to bring it about. Sustainabilists particularly focus on the threat of overpopulation as the source of environmental degradation and poverty. And yet, their very policies are actually designed to create more poverty and reduction of our standard of living. And you find that, if you find that hard to believe, now let me give you this quote from a Professor King, who's a major advocate of sustainable policy. I'll let him tell you. "Global sustainability," quote, "global sustainability requires the deliberate quest of poverty, reduced resource consumption, and set levels of mortality control." Set levels of mortality control, end quote. Truth is, overpopulation is one of the main scare tactics used to herd the rest of us into accepting sustainable policy. So how do you reduce the population? by enforcing the proven Chinese method of one child per family and sterilization and forced abortion on those who defy the rules? David Brower of the Sierra Club has a solution. He said, quote, "Childbearing should be a punishable crime against society unless the parents hold a government license. All potential parents should be required to use contraceptive chemicals, the government issuing antidotes to citizens chosen for childbearing." My friends, this is the mindset of the people who are creating the policies that you are now being forced to live under, that your elected officials are putting in place, and they're saying that I am a crazed conspiracy theorist. I didn't say any of these things. They did. Here's an inconvenient fact. All of the population of the world could fit into an area the size of Texas with a population density of Paris, France. Does that sound like overpopulation? Does it call for a need to panic and establish a worldwide dictatorship to combat it? Or do we just have bad governments where people are starving and the environment's being degraded because of it? All of these attacks on our society, they say, are urgent in order to save the planet. Environmental Armageddon. That is the foot on your throat. I've had them say to me, you can have all the liberties you want. It doesn't matter. Because if you don't have a planet to stand on, then so what how many liberties you think you have? And that's the environmental Armageddon scare tactic they use for every one of these. Take that away, would we accept any of the rest of this? To save the planet, they tell us, we all need to sacrifice, reduce, stop. A leftist author named Ted Trainer has written a book entitled Transition to a Sustainable and Just World. His book is really nothing more than a blueprint for establishing Marxist principles into your local community. He said this, quote, "The alternative has to be the simpler way, a society based on non-affluent lifestyles within mostly small and highly self-sufficient local economies under the local participatory control and not driven by market forces or the profit motive, with no economic growth. There must be an enormous cultural change away from competitive individual acquisition of wealth," end quote. We're talking about here? What's happening to your children in the public schools? The curriculum there, that's the cultural change. When they raise the taxes on use of energy so that you no longer drive as much as you'd like to because you can't afford it, or you turn down the thermostat in your house, or what kinds of businesses could be in your community, all these things. This is how they do it, step by step. Cultural change. That's what they're talking about. The call for zero economic growth was also heard at the UN's Rio Plus 20 summit in 2012. Trainer's motto for all of us is that you must live on less. That's what it's about. Apparently, the goal is more poverty, not less. Using less power and infrastructure, they say, is more sustainable. And yet, this is where I find it funny. The elimination of poverty is the stated driving force behind massive programs throughout the world, from the United Nations to individual national governments to private organizations. The images are put there in front of us every day. Poverty in the world. How horrible. Starving children, unimaginable hardships, hopelessness. Somebody must do something. So we hear over and over and over again. Of course, the answer from the world's leadership is to throw money at the problem, either through volunteer charity programs or mandatory taxation. It makes great TV sound bites. It gets them votes. It makes people feel good to want to help the less fortunate. combat the situation, there are massive efforts underway, from churches to charitable organizations to local, state, federal, and international government programs designed to eradicate poverty. It's what we hear constantly. Billions of dollars in foreign aid have been distributed to countries around the world to help feed the poor. Poverty reduction targets have been set. International goals have been announced. Deadlines have been determined. Agreement has been reached by every national leader that poverty must be eradicated. But understand why they're doing this. The anti-poverty drive in every single case is designed to increase the size, cost, reach, and power of government. I call it the compassion cartel. And it's all about redistribution of wealth. It's creating a new power elite. What it doesn't do is eliminate poverty. Today, it's all driven under the banner of sustainable development in Agenda 21, all under the excuse of environmental protection and social justice, social equity. It's what you hear constantly. Social justice is nothing more than redistribution of wealth. And if you listen to their words carefully, you will make a horrible discovery. What they really mean when they're talking about reducing or eradicating poverty is a change in the status for each of us. Under the terms of sustainable development, we are all to be equal, living on less, pawns in the great wheel of society. In short, we are all to be poor because they say that is sustainable. In fact, as they subject us all to this redistribution of wealth in order to sentence more and more to a lifetime of breadlines, the only thing that changes is that we have more and more poor. Poverty is a growth industry, and it's designed to be that way. It gives government the ability to take more and more power, all in the name of compassion. But not one of these agencies, government or private, spends a second of their time working on ways to end poverty and create a process to allow the poor to pull themselves up. That is the root of their scheme. But here's a secret that they don't want you to know. The more poor you have, the more environmental destruction is created. People struggling just to survive really don't have time to worry about the environment. That's a rich man's game. But while most of the power forces in the world think this way, there are a few Tom Smiths who see real solutions to poverty and misery, and they see a better way for everybody to move forward in the world. In 2006, I was surprised to find myself at a formal meal in the middle of a 200-year-old debating society at Cambridge University in England. In a few minutes, I and 5 others were about to engage in a debate over the usefulness of the United Nations. But here, for a few minutes longer, at this long dinner table with the crisp white tablecloth, I was sitting next to one of my fellow debaters. His name was Salih Shetty, and he was the head of the UN's Millennium Project. By the way, 2 other people I was debating that day were Lord David Haney, the former UK ambassador to the UN, and Simon Hughes, the head of the Liberal Party and Member of Parliament. That's who I was debating. I had 2 people on my side. One was named Ted Knight. He was known affectionately in England as Red Ted. He's a communist, a labor leader. And the associate editor of the Guardian newspaper, who was supposed to be our anchor, who gets up at the end of the debate to make his opening statement and says, "Well, I don't mind the United Nations, I just don't like the United States in it." Whereupon I said, "We can help." It's 5-1 as usual, and I got creamed. But I'll tell you more about that in a minute. But the Millennium Project was commissioned by the UN to create, and this is their words, a concrete action plan to reverse poverty and hunger. Now, I had ignored Mr. Shetty through most of the dinner, but with just a few minutes left to go before the debate, I finally turned to him and I said, "You realize you don't have a prayer, don't you?" And he looked at me and he said, "About what?" And I said, "Ending poverty by 2015 using redistribution of wealth," because that's one of the 8 listed goals of the UN's Millennium Project that was accepted by world leaders in 2000. He looked at me and he said, "Yeah, I know." I began to talk to him about the need to help the poor to escape from poverty on their own rather than being condemned to lifelong breadlines. I talked about the need to establish private property rights as a means to build wealth. I mentioned that it was estimated to be about $10 trillion in dead capital in the world. That's property in the world that no one is allowed to own or invest in. $10 trillion would help a lot of poor people. Mr. Shetty looked at me as I made these observations and he said to me, "Hernando de Soto." And I excitedly looked at him and said, "Yes, that's who I was talking about. That's who I was quoting." De Soto is an economist from Peru who has made it his life's work to help end poverty in the world by promoting private property ownership. We actually we invited him to be here today and he wasn't able to make it. To my amazement, Mr. Shetty looked at me and he said, "I have associates who are looking upon these ideas, De Soto's ideas, favorably." Just as soon as he said those words, the call came for us to head into the debating hall to begin our event. And of course, we were on opposite sides. As soon as the debate was over, as I said, I was outnumbered 5-1, as usual, I made a beeline over to Mr. Shetty and I said, "Mr. Shetty, you and I started a conversation and I want to finish it." So, a few weeks later, I traveled to New York City to meet him at his office at the UN. And during our discussion, he told me that in his city in India, the local government was beginning to go over property records and officially register ownership, something that had never been done before. And the result was the economy of the community was beginning to improve. That is exactly what Hernando de Soto is making. The point that he's making as he travels the world meeting with national leaders. In most of the world, people may own their homes. Perhaps through an underground economy, but they have no official records through the government to prove it. Without that official proof of registration, they have no means to use the property for equity loans so that they can essentially move up. It becomes dead capital. In his book, De Soto's book, which is entitled "The Mystery of Capital: Why Capitalism Triumphs in the West and Fails Everywhere Else," De Soto explains the major difference between our American system and most other nations in the world. Capital, he argues, quote, "is the force that raises the productivity of labor and creates the wealth of nations. It is the lifeblood of the capitalist system, the foundation of progress, and the only thing that poor countries of the world cannot seem to produce for themselves." Instead, the sustainabilists attack capitalism as the root of all the evil in the world, and the world grows poorer and more oppressed. De Soto estimates that nearly 5 billion people around the world are legally and economically disenfranchised by their own governments because they are denied a comprehensive legal property system. That means their property cannot serve them as an asset. In the United States and Canada and a few other nations, every single piece of privately held property, homes, or even large equipment is registered. In fact, in the U.S., the county registrar's office is the most important tool of freedom, as it is where every American can prove their ownership of their property. Because of that system, average Americans can use their property as a tool to obtain loans. Do you know that 60% of American companies have been started through equity loans on private property? And those privately held companies now employ about 60% of the American workforce? That is how private property ownership made the United States the richest nation in the world almost overnight. Lack of such a system is the reason why most of the world is falling into extreme poverty. The people have no way out of poverty, and they are forced to rely on government handouts. The laws and practices of most countries in the world make it nearly impossible for average citizens to own property or to prove ownership of property. There are vast obstacles to gaining legal ownership. For example, in Mexico, it takes 20 years before a piece of property can be recorded. And guess how many greased hands of bureaucrats you have to cover on that too. In Peru, where Hernando de Soto is from, his team of experts it took them 289 days to legally register a new business, even after paying over $1,200 in registration fees. Do you know what the impact of $1,200 is on a poor nation? It's enough to forever discourage even the attempt to register property. Such an amount in many developing countries may equal an entire year's income or much more. In the Philippines, a prospective property owner would first have to organize an association with his prospective neighbors in order to qualify for a state housing finance program. The entire process could take 168 steps involving 53 public and private agencies and taking 13 to 25 years. And so it goes in country after country. It's important to note the impact free markets and private property have on the income of nations and their citizens. The per capita income of Americans is about $41,400 a year. For Europeans, where more government control is exercised, the per capita income is about $27,400. In the former communist nations of Eastern Europe, it is now $3,295. Only a few years ago, however, it was $2,047. As more freedom and greater ability to own property grows, so does the per capita income. If ownership of property cannot be properly recorded and able to be traced directly to the owner, then it cannot create equity and cannot be used as collateral for credit. It is not of value to the owners, it's only an expense. This situation has created, as I said before, in De Soto's estimate, about $9.3 trillion in dead capital. That is property that cannot be used by anyone to create wealth or equity. While it is common practice in the United States, and I'm sure in Canada as well, to buy property, hold it for a few years, and sell it at a substantial profit or move up to a better home, thereby creating individual wealth, such a system is basically unheard of in most nations of the world. If one doesn't have or can't prove title, then no bank will make a loan on the property. In nations where property cannot be easily and legally registered, the only recourse is to go to friends and relatives, get a smaller loan, thereby reducing one's ability to build equity. But they still never have title to the property. Though people may live on it and pay for the property for years, it is hidden in an underground economy not beneficial to the individual or to the national economy because ownership cannot be shown. In the West, by contrast, De Soto argues, every parcel of land, every building, every piece of equipment or store of inventory is represented in a property document that is visible, the visible sign of vast hidden process that connects all of these assets to the rest of the economy. De Soto's book was called The Blueprint for a New Industrial Revolution by the Times of London. Today, Hernando de Soto travels the world, meeting with world leaders who anxiously seek his guidance on how they can end poverty in their nations. Now you would think, oh goody, Great, finally, revolution. Yet, when he tells them the secret, private property ownership, many balk, telling him with a troubled smile that the people in their nations just aren't ready for such a policy. They just don't understand the concept of private property ownership. The excuse goes on and on. So the promise of the great new industrial revolution that could spread wealth to every corner of the world never gets off the ground. A few years ago, I had the great privilege of a private meeting with Hernando de Soto. And he told me a story of one such meeting that he had with a national leader. He didn't tell me what country it was. But he said he'd been through enough of these meetings with such leaders that he can almost anticipate what they're going to say. In this particular meeting, he knew this leader was going to tell him that his people just didn't understand private property rights. They just weren't ready for it. So, before the meeting, De Soto sent a team into the neighborhood around the presidential palace and knocked on doors to ask everybody in the neighborhood if they owned their homes. Keep in mind, this is a nation where home ownership is not in the legal process. Yet every single one of them said, "Yes, I own my home." So De Soto's team asked them to produce some kind of a document, some kind of evidence that may show that they had home ownership. And they did. They all had either a bill of sale, a receipt, or even a copy of a will. In any case, they had something to prove their ownership, even though there was no official government registration. De Soto took copies of these items with him to the meeting. And he said to the leader of the country, he laid them on the table in front of them, showed them what they were, and he says, "Now let's get this out of the way. Your people understand private property rights. Now let's find a way to make sure they got it." There are three main reasons the world has not experienced De Soto's new industrial revolution. First is the mindset of the compassion cartel that almost everyone in the world has accepted. Government, private foundations, and charities have made poverty big business. Help the poor, tax the rich. How dare they get so wealthy while others suffer? Theft becomes noble. The second reason is bad government. These are led by dictators who refuse to give up their power over the people by supplying them the means for ending poverty. Poverty is very helpful to dictators because poor people are powerless to rise up against them. Poverty is also convenient to rouse the rabble against political opponents and spread fear. You know, one of our kind of people come along and say, "These programs are worthless. They're costing people money. We need to cut these programs." What happens? All of the people on those programs rise up. "You are trying to take money out of my pocket, food out of my child's mouth." Those who are barely hanging on from meal to meal are easy to scare with threats from any proposal that dares to differ from the redistribution schemes, even if, in the long run, that would be the best thing for them to find their way out of poverty. And the third reason the world is sinking into ever greater poverty is the environmental movement, defined by Agenda 21 and sustainable development. It's a new style of dictatorship that actually prefers people to remain poor, living in mud huts with no infrastructure, no running water, no electricity. That, they claim, is sustainable. How cute. Cameron Diaz traveled from her mansion in Beverly Hills on her private jet to Africa to visit a little African village. The people who were living in mud huts with dung on the walls, and they had to walk 5 miles a day to get their water and sit around the campfire at night to cook their food. And she thought it was so cute. Then she went back to her mansion in Beverly Hills. Barbara Streisand says every one of you should stop using electric dryers to protect the environment. However, a gentleman took his private airplane and flew over all 5 of her estates and didn't find a single hanger clothesline out in her yard. You see, In the utopia of sustainable development, poverty is unacceptable only as long as it doesn't threaten the worldwide agenda for control. Believe it or not, there is a worldwide sustainable development program to prohibit funding of development projects in third world countries if the projects don't fit the environmental agenda. It's called the Equator Principle. According to their own documents, the Equator Principle was established in association with the World Bank's International Finance Corporation in 2003. The Equator Principles have been adopted by at least 73 major financial institutions around the world, covering over 70% of international projects such as dams and mines and pipelines. In short, such policy actually leads to what we can only call environmental racism. A few white, rich people who live in luxury in their first world nations have made a determination that some who now live in mud huts with no indoor power and no clean running water must stay that way because they have determined it is more sustainable for the planet. Environmental racism. Stopping development for the poor has become a major drive by sustainabilists. 3 American financial institutions are associated to the Equator Principles, including the Bank of America, J.P. Morgan Chase, and Citigroup. Citigroup is a major player in that process. It has used these voluntary green standards to turn down development loans for projects like shopping centers, power plants, and housing projects in Africa and other developing nations. Now, why would Citicorp do this? Why would they turn around the possibility of huge sums of new business? Because dedicated sustainabilists believe it is environmentally correct to leave African natives untouched by modern society. They believe it is environmentally sound. They deny these people electricity to light even a bulb in their huts. Of course, there's no internet. There are few roads. There are fewer cars. Walk wherever you go, scratch out a living in the wild and be ignored by the rest of the world. That is environmentally correct. That is sustainable development. The Equator Principles are applied to all project financing transactions. At least as each project application is presented for funding, the project is carefully reviewed to determine if it meets comprehensive international performance standards, Agenda 21, on issues such as labor and working conditions, natural resource management, pollution prevention, impacts on indigenous people, community health and safety, and cross-cutting themes such as gender and human rights. My friends, if you get a copy of Agenda 21 and just look at the index at the front of all the chapters that are in there, that's them. This is straight out of those chapters. Break it down. Natural resource management, for example, means no drilling of oil or minerals. Water use is restricted. Labor and working conditions? You deny the loan because of labor and working conditions? What, we don't have the AFL-CIO there? Ask America's Rust Belt, in Youngstown, in Pittsburgh, how such restrictions forced them. The same labor rules and environmental regulations derailed that are detailed in the Equator Principles led to the destruction of industry and to empty American factories decades ago. Community health and safety? Sure. No clean water? No modern medical facilities? No reliable transportation? How are health and safety supposed to happen? As a result of this kind of environmental racism, the world is now threatened by an Ebola outbreak that cannot be contained because effective health care cannot be administered. The countries are too poor and undeveloped to provide it. Gender and human rights to decide whether you're going to have a loan or not? What does gender have to do with building a power plant, and how does a new dam affect women's rights? All of these terms are social justice. They're weapons used by self-appointed NGO stakeholder groups to promote their own political agendas. NGOs, if I haven't said it before, is non-governmental organizations. They're the driving force behind sustainable development. I'll explain later how that operates. The people who just want to improve their lives and have simple things like running water and heated homes and common utilities, which you and I take for granted every day, are caught in the middle, pawns and victims sentenced to a life of poverty, sickness, and neglect. And how does all this directly affect you? They are now using sustainable development policy to destroy the middle class in once rich industrial nations. And they are doing it by destroying private property ownership. Literally, every classroom in the industrialized world now teaches socialism and redistribution of wealth as the proper economics of the day. As a result, students will be unable to even understand the simple logic of Hernando de Soto's remedy for worldwide poverty. And yet, every single one of those kids has been trained to go, somebody's got to do something. But what do? Well, back to my debate at Cambridge. Does that answer? Following the formal debate, the audience went into a reception. About 400 people. I was the only speaker to join them. All the rest of them left. They were much more important than I was. As I entered the room, a young student, I can still see her face, a young lady, came up to me and she said, "Excuse me, can I ask you a question?" I said, "Sure." She said, "You really don't believe in redistribution of wealth?" And I said, "No, it's theft." And she said, "But if somebody has more than they need, shouldn't they share it with somebody who doesn't?" I said, "Why should they?" And she looked at me like I had slapped her. Here she was, one of the bright students at one of the great universities of the world. She had never heard an argument against redistribution of wealth or for a free market. So I gave it to her. And guess what? I held court in that room for the next 2 hours as all these students gathered around me, throwing questions at me and asking me questions. I explained that if I take money from them today so that one more unfortunate can eat, then tomorrow they're going to need more, and I got to take more. And again, the next day, and the next day, and the next day. And I will need to take more from each of them every day. All of which we will need to, you can't just have charity and take and give. You've got to have administrators, bureaucrats, who take theirs off the top before it gets trickled down over here. And I pointed out that the mere fact that I had the power to take their wealth for that purpose exposed the fact that I actually owned and controlled their money, not them. Such is the true nature of the system of government and redistribution of wealth. And that's why I called it theft. Worse, you have gained nothing in the battle to help the poor other than to delay their agony for another day. At best, you have offered a Band-Aid. At worst, such policy doesn't prevent poverty. There is another cause for growing poverty, and you haven't addressed it. So, tomorrow, there will be more poor and more. And each time, you will be forced to provide more and more aid from your now dwindling funds, until one day, you too may find yourself forced onto the breadlines, depending on someone else for your daily's essentials. When I finished my explanation, there was a moment of silence in the group that had gathered, and then the same girl said, "What an interesting point of view. How can I learn more?" And I wanted to scream, Economics 101. To point such things out is called heartless and probably racist. What kind of evil person calls helping the poor theft? Well, take a good look at the world we live in. According to Mr. Shetty's Millennium Project, there are currently 1.2 billion people living in poverty. That's probably higher now. 50,000 deaths a day occur worldwide as a result of poverty. Every year, more than 10 million children die of hunger and preventable diseases. More than half the world's population lives on less than $2 per day, and 800 million people go to bed hungry every night. This is after we have poured billions and billions, probably trillions, worldwide into helping the poor. If they just give them all $1 million and go away, but the bureaucrats would have to take theirs off the top. To combat all this, we have the compassion cartel. We have thousands of charitable organizations and faith-based programs designed to feed the children, along with education programs designed to create awareness of poverty and starvation. I get it. I know why they're poor. I know they're there. Their ads run on television nightly, pulling out at our heartstrings to do something. Most of these charities have built up huge organizations with highly paid administrations working out of impressive buildings with large staffs. As I said, poverty is big business. Every politician preaches the gospel of helping the poor, and as a result, more than half of, at least in America, half of every paycheck disappears into government coffers even before it hits our own pockets. As a result of such policy, we now have demonstrations across America by workers demanding a higher minimum wage. I saw a sign the other day of a girl saying, "I'm worth more." And they blame greedy companies and capitalism for their lack of money. Imagine how much money they would actually have in their pockets if they got to keep what the employers actually paid them before government's got its hands on it to redistribute it to the compassion cartel. Billions of dollars of aid pour into federal and international programs to distribute to countries around the world to help feed the poor. Poverty reductions have been set, goals have been announced, deadlines for ending poverty have been determined, and every national and international leader has signed documents to pledge that poverty must be eradicated. They love it when the TV cameras are there for that. And the result of this worldwide focus on poverty, as I said, is we have more poor. It's a growth industry. Why? Because not one of these programs offers a single plan to allow the poor to help themselves. Instead, the compassion cartel has sentenced every single poor person in the world to a future of lifelong breadlines, allowing them to be victims of demagogues, con artists, and harsh, hopeless, futureless lives. There is no consideration for their hopes and dreams and no real understanding of the hopelessness of their lives. And the middle class of once mighty, wealthy nations like the United States is quickly dissolving under the burden of the redistribution schemes. More poor in our once proud nation. In the self-proclaimed compassion industry, if it had true concern for the poor, it would begin an international drive to empower the poor by allowing them to build their own wealth, thereby getting themselves off of those lifelong breadlines. Hernando de Soto has offered that way. He has called for the establishment of private property rights that would allow people from around the world to build personal wealth and the ability to invest in new enterprises that would in return employ more, help build infrastructure to allow still more to have electricity, heating, cooling, clean water in their homes, improving health and the quality of their lives. Step by step, these improvements would lead to creating more wealth worldwide, reducing the burden on the rest of us, and in turn help us all build more wealth, strengthening our quality of life. Help the poor help themselves. It will also help you. That is true compassion. That is a real solution. But to take such a step would require a rejection of socialism and an embracing of capitalism. And that, says the compassion cartel, can never be allowed, because that would lead to empowering individuals to control their own lives. Instead, in the name of compassion, oppression is a well-ordered society is so much more efficient. Remember the words to Tom Smith by the man at Antitrust? The rule of law in complex times has proved itself deficient. We much prefer the rule of man. It's vastly more efficient. It is becoming increasingly clear that poverty will never be eradicated unless all of us stop being cowed by the compassion cartel and its self-proclaimed control over everyone's earned wealth, hopes, and dreams. Today's poor and undeveloped nations certainly want the same opportunities to advance, yet many now live in societies that are in some ways 3,000 years behind the modern world. It's time to realize that the sustainabilists who profess compassion to save the world really don't want to help the environment or eradicate poverty or even improve human living conditions. Sustainable development was created to rein in the radical ideas of individualism and personal property ownership, and to harmonize all nations into a global tyranny and control. And it will result in a dark ages across the world unlike anything ever experienced in human society. So, a vitally important question that we must all ask, and we must ask it now while we still can. Do we really have to sit here helplessly as the sustainabilists and the compassion cartel make every decision in our lives? Is the only future for the world's poor to be condemned to lifelong breadlines, totally dependent on someone else for every morsel of food and human need? What about their hopes and dreams for a life of their own? Or can we take back control of our own lives and at the same time end the tragedy of worldwide poverty and control? The answer is yes, we can. We can do it as free individuals, free of government oppression, and we can not only improve our own lives, but the lives of nearly everyone on earth. One fact is clear. You cannot implement sustainable development without diminishing property rights. Stand up for property rights, and we can stop sustainable development and its tyranny. There was once a mighty society that rejected the shackles on human determination to move forward. It was based on reason, and it provided hope and the answer to the promise of life. It rejected the idea that people were only to expect mere existence as a human condition. Do you want that world again? Then stop accepting their charges that you lack compassion for others, that you are selfish and racist because you don't accept government as the answer. Reject their label of guilt and demand to be free of their tyranny. We don't have to put up with their grand schemes to keep all of us poor and pliable, and that's what it's about. We are the ones who respect human dignity and demand that all people be allowed to accomplish their hopes and dreams, not governments seeking power over us all. We are the ones who seek honesty and reason in the lives of all people, not governments run by dictators and self-proclaimed rulers who refuse to relinquish power no matter the consequence. It won't take massive government programs or taxes. It will take one thing: for government to get out of the way and let the human spirit shine through. In fact, the sustainabilists' worst nightmare is that their drive for global governance is that we teach the people of the world that government is the problem, not the answer. And that is exactly what we need to do. We can do it. We can release a world of Tom Smiths in every nation. We can end poverty and create hope. Allow individuals all over the world the opportunity to stand on their own, to achieve their own hopes and dreams without interference. Private property ownership and its unrestricted use are the foundation for a worldwide revolution for freedom. Let that revolution begin here, today, with each of us. Thank you.
You need some compassion in your speech.
We have about 10 minutes that we can take questions. Again, if I can have those folks that want to ask a question to line up in the center aisle. Unless you have mobility issues, then raise your hand, we'll come find you. Hello?
Yes.
Just a quick question. It's a matter of semantics, I think, more than anything else. But on a political note, do you equate progressives with sustainabilists?
Absolutely. There's progress and there's progressives. In fact, I never use that term because it offends me so much. You got liberals and you got communists. It's one or the other.
Just a statement I gave recently to my bishop. It was, if it is true we are here to help others, then what exactly are the others here for?
I like that.
I actually wish Hernando de Soto was here.
Me too.
Because if he was here, when he describes capitalism, he describes the destruction of capitalism as it affects the poor. He does not condone what passes as capitalism with the extraordinary privileges being given by government policies to the extremely rich. And I think when one hears this discussion, the tone that you have conveyed is far too much. One can do whatever one wants with what one can acquire by whatever means. Our principles underlying our society start with a very different premise, and that is that one cannot exploit or abuse anyone or their rights. And Hernando de Soto would strongly emphasize that, while at the same time emphasizing the need to establish capitalist principles for the poor.
I wholeheartedly agree with you. This attitude in the world and their attacks on capitalism, they keep painting capitalism as this evil force where these massive rich corporations are able to run roughshod over everybody, and we've got to stop all that. True, but what created that? When you get government that is so massively big that it affects every aspect of your life, then of course companies are going to get involved in government, and they're going to try to make the rules and regulations, and of course they're going to start their cronyism, and they're going to start rubbing shoulders with them, and they're going to start making the decisions that benefit them. That is not free enterprise. That's not capitalism. That is really one of the three tenets of sustainable development, of Agenda 21. You have the three connecting circles. And one of them is social equity, which I mentioned, social justice. One is environmental. The third one is economics, public-private partnerships. Public-private partnerships are not free enterprise. This is right out of Mussolini's playbook on fascism, and that's what is happening there. So these, this is not free enterprise. It's not what I'm talking about.
I will say, though, that if one does want to have a much broader engaged public in understanding what property is and what property rights are, then we have to find a way not to alienate those who happen to vote Liberal, who happen to vote NDP, who also share the deep views that the system that has come to be known as capitalism and that is presented as capitalism is the right way. So one has to be very careful in looking at Hernando de Soto to make the distinction he would make between the capitalism and state corporatism. And I think we really need to emphasize that, because getting the principles of property rights entrenched requires getting the support of those who think of themselves as belonging to the left.
I wholeheartedly agree with you. No argument.
As a practical matter, I'm wondering, given that the Supreme Court of the United States has allowed PACs and super PACs to virtually raise and spend unlimited amounts of money, no matter from where, whether it be from China or from what are the Koch brothers, whoever. And we know that advertising equals election. What do you have any? I mean, how do you eliminate the vast money from the political equation? Do you have any idea how we actually do that?
You know what's funny about that discussion is nobody ever mentions the massive amounts of money that the environmental movement has. It's always industry money. It's always big evil corporations that are spending money. Well, first of all, our last little discussion here aside about corporations, but there are, free enterprise. There are companies that are being oppressed by these processes, these policies, and they do they not have a right to speak out? Do they not have a right to have a say in it all? The environmental movement has so many spider webs of money. They've got massive foundations. They've got the Environmental Grant Makers Association. These guys have so much control of money that they decide if they want to stop a hospital being built somewhere, and this is a real example in Los Angeles, they find, oh, there's a sand flea in there, and that's endangered. And what they do then is they put $1 million into a bank account and create a Save the Sand Flea organization. And next thing you know, they got news releases and everything else. That also counts in what's going on in the elections. But yet they attack the Koch brothers who are in the mining industry, the coal industry, who are being oppressed, who are being run out of business by these things. And if they put money into organizations to help their cause, suddenly that's evil. They never once mention all the money that goes into the unions. That's not counted. That's not part of it. Totally ignored. So it's a level playing field. What do you do in elections? People who are affected by what the outcome of that election is going to bring, do they not have a right to speak out on it? And yeah, there's massive amounts of money on both sides. So.
I have a very different question. I used to work for industry, and my problem was they didn't fight. Industry here doesn't fight, and it's a massive problem, except for forestry. I love those guys. So how do we get industry to fight? Because they appease all the time, appease.
Yeah.
And we need their money. Guys, we need their money. There's nothing wrong with industry.
Sure. Yeah. By the way, just one little caveat for my last comment there. If you reduce the size and power of government, there won't be the need for that much money into it. They'll not be affected by it all. So that's the answer. How do we get them involved? One of the things that's been happening for the last 20 years, the other side is really good at recruiting. They've recruited all these industries that they say they hate. They want to destroy all these industries, but they've recruited them. They help them find a way. This is where the public-private partnerships come in. Cronyism. For example, hotels. How many times have you gone into a hotel and you see the little card there that says, we're not going to wash your sheets today or your towels, we're going to save the environment. I go down to the desk and I say, how much you taking off my bill because I got less service? They have recruited all of these businesses to their side because they find a way to benefit them, to make money from it. And then they get a plaque and a pat on the back and a banquet. And we don't, because of course that's abhorrent that we do anything to do that. But you have to, in every case, you've got, if you want to fight back and you want to recruit people onto your side, you've got to show them the pain of it, what that pain is going to be, what's the result of that going to be. I think, and this is one thing I wanted to say about going into Agenda 21. All these years we've talked about Agenda 21, we have, people listened to us, and then they went rushing into their local governments and yelling, you're implementing UN Agenda 21. And like, what? Because your elected officials probably have not heard that. At least at that time, they had never heard that. What are you talking about? Because they never used that term. So what we're trying to teach people now is don't do that. Look at what is it about the policies that they're trying to implement that bother you? What is it that is going to affect you? And focus on the policy. And you can do this with the industry too. Focus on the policy and how the results will be. It might affect everybody in town. It might just affect people over here in this neighborhood. And if it's just these people in this neighborhood, go to the neighborhood, say, do you know what they're planning to do? They're going to put a regulation in, it's going to do this to you. And then you can recruit people to your side. If it's the whole town, of course, you've got a bigger job. It's the same job. But focus on the policy rather than yelling about Agenda 21. You can always, the one thing with our side, we're intellectuals. We are information sponges. We get all this information in our head, and we know economics, and we know this, and we want to share all of that with some poor guy standing there who's trying to go like this. But I'll tell you something else. The other side, what do? They operate in sound bites. The main sound bite of the other side is based on what I liken to a 10-year-old girl in a pet shop who sees the animals in the cages. She goes, somebody let them out. Somebody's got to do something. That's their entire argument. Somebody's got to do something. And then you're left to say, well, now, economically, that won't work. And philosophically, we have limited government. People quit listening because we got to let them out. So you've got to kind of take on some of those tactics. Focus on the policy rather than the whole world. So.
How you doing? I'm Al McGregor, and I live in a municipality that's not on the map. We don't want it on the map. We don't want people to move there. Anyway, our motto is country living at its best. Yesterday, I was down in Smith Falls with Tim Hortons with a friend, and he says, Hal, if you go over and see Pete the Greek, get him a burning permit, he'll give you anything he wants. Anything you want. I said, okay. He went over and he wasn't there. But he bought up the old flea market, and he's got a whole bunch of junk in there that some people like to go in and mull over. And he says, you get him a burning permit. My friend said, get him a burning permit. I said, I can get that. No problem. So I drove up to Montague Town Council, or Village Council, whatever. And the receptionist is a sweet little thing. And I said, can I have 2 building permits, please? She said, sure. So I just filled it. For myself, Hal McGregor, I live up on 1054 McRae Road. No problem, okay. Made a copy and gave it to me. You're all set. So the other one I put Pete the Greek. And 7954 Road, downtown sort of thing, the urban center of Montague. And she's, oh, he can't have one. He can't have a building permit. I said, why not? He lives in Adirondack. And he's been told that he can't burn down there. I said, what do you mean? He says, in the build-up areas of Montague, you can't build a fire. You can't have a bonfire. Now, I checked. Yes, you're right. In the Municipal Act, a municipality cannot implement bylaws on property it doesn't own. But they do it all the time.
They do. I guess essentially they do it all the time because we let them. And I want to show you something here. We've tried, as we're trying to train people to use new tactics, so forth. We created a document. You get this off my website. If some of you bought my booklet like this, which are now gone, it's in there. This is a resolution to protect citizens' property rights. And all this document says is, if they're going to discuss something that's going to take place on your property that's going to affect you, they've got some kind of plan that's going to affect your property, they bring you into the discussion. Second thing it says is, if they go ahead with that program, they're going to compensate you for whatever your loss is. The third thing it says is, they can't just bring these planners and all these little bureaucrats on your property willy-nilly. They've got to get your written permission. That's what it says. Really radical document. Now, what we're teaching people to do, now in the U.S., with city council, county commissioner meetings, you get 3 whole minutes to make your position. And by the way, you don't do this by yourself. But you get those 3 minutes, Instead of going up saying, you're implementing UN Agenda 20, you go up and say, ladies, gentlemen, as you're bringing these plans and these planners into our community, I just got one question for you. What guarantees do I have that you'll protect my property rights? Now, what we've experienced is, to a person, they'll say, of course I will. Hey, I'm a property owner too. And you just smile and you say, well, I'm really happy to hear you say that, but gentlemen, I like it in writing, please. Now watch them turn white. Now sometimes they'll say, well, we need to take that under advisement. Okay, so come back the next time. Taking it under advisement means we've got to take it back to the NGOs and ask them, can we sign this thing? No! And they won't sign it. Absolutely won't sign it. Now, when they come back, you go back to the meeting, or even at night, whichever the case may be, where they've refused to sign it. You ask the most radical question in the English language. Why? Now, you can't do this alone. Because when they say to you, no, they're very good at going, poof, you're all by yourself. Get out of here. When they say that to you, you need 15 more people to stand up and say, why won't you sign that? Everybody stand up. Everybody stand up. You need this anyway. Everybody say, why? Why? Say it again. Why? Say it again. Why? That's the way your public meetings need to sound. They need to know you're there. We done?
Can I just ask one question?
Absolutely.
One
last question to the lady in pink.
Yeah, one last question. The City of Ottawa, the City of Ottawa has a policy that says that if you want a severance, if you want to sever a single lot, that you have to drill a well, have a hydrogeological study done, and if you don't meet the parameters of a guideline from the province, then you don't get your severance. Now, we've been fighting for about 6 months this particular practice of theirs, and there have only been 3 wells dug that we know of, and they have been rejected because their aesthetic parameters, nothing to do with health and safety, the aesthetic parameters exceed the 20-year-old parameters. And in each of those 3 cases, the professional engineer that drilled the wells recommended that the severance go ahead because the water was easily treatable. I don't really have a question here.
Yeah.
I just wanted to, I just really wanted to get that out there because I just think it's so ridiculous.
This is what you're saying, though, is vitally important, because what we're talking about here is creating policies where a cadre, a certain few, are making the decisions in back rooms, and when you have that kind of power, then you exercise it. And that's what you're seeing them do. They should never have that kind of power. And these, we had a case in, I believe it was in Utah. A lady wanted to plant an organic garden in her front yard. She went to the mayor and the city council, and they said, yeah, go ahead. So she started to do it. And all of a sudden, the zoning comes around, says, violation. She spent time in a tank over this. They arrested her, put her in handcuffs, and arrested her for that. This is the kind of when we talk about Agenda 21 across the country, sustainable development, and we're always getting these people saying, well, you're against zoning, you're against our being able to have anything to do in the community to control how anything is done. There is zoning, and there are plans in communities. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about this kind of Nazi-style overreach that is unreasonable, makes absolutely no sense, and people are going to jail for it. Why? Because somebody wants to build power. What they're really doing is trying to make it impossible for you to live on rural areas and herd you into cities. That's the root of it.
Tom, on behalf of the CLA, we want to thank you for joining us today and sharing all of your knowledge with us. It's greatly appreciated. Small token of our appreciation here.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, thanks. Thank you.